Morning light streamed through the picture windows of the Lawrence home, reflecting off the polished oak floors. The spacious kitchen, which smelled of freshly brewed coffee and warm croissants, seemed cut out of a magazine about luxurious living. Xavier Lawrence, tall, with light gray in his dark hair, stood at the tabletop, scrolling through a presentation on a tablet. His dark blue tailored suit fit perfectly, but he still adjusted his tie, as if checking to make sure everything was under control. Today was important. California investors could take his green building materials company to the next level. Xavier, haven't you eaten again? Thalia's voice, soft, but with a slight note of irritation, came from the living room. She entered, straightening her jacket, her brown hair pulled back into a neat bun. Green eyes glanced briefly at her husband, but immediately looked away to the purse, which she grabbed from the chair. Coffee is food, Xavier grinned, not looking up from the screen. You know, before such meetings, I'm on adrenaline. Thalia rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched into a smile. She walked up to him, put her hand on his shoulder, and kissed him on the cheek. She smelled of floral perfume, but Xavier detected something else, a slight note of tension, as if she was holding back a sigh. Good luck today, she said, already heading out. Lillian, hurry up. The school bus is not waiting. Lillian, their 15-year-old daughter, ran down the stairs, her long dark hair bouncing with her steps. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, with a backpack slung casually over one shoulder. She clutched a sketchbook in her hands, as if it were her talisman. Mom, I told you I'm walking. Lillian glanced at Thalia, then at her father. Dad, will you be at my exhibition on Friday? Xavier put the tablet down and smiled. Lillian rarely asked for anything directly, and her exhibition in the school gallery was a matter of honor for her. Of course, Lil, I've already cleared the evening. Will you show me your masterpieces? She nodded, but her smile was restrained, almost forced. Xavier frowned, but Lillian had already turned to her mother. Mom, will you come? Thalia froze at the door, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse a little tighter than necessary. She turned around, and a shadow of uncertainty flashed across her face, which Xavier noticed, but did not have time to comprehend. I'll try, honey, Thalia said. Our company is in a mess right now, but I'll think of something. Lillian just nodded, but her shoulders sagged slightly. She muttered something like bye and left, slamming the door a little louder than usual. Xavier looked at Thalia, expecting her to say something, but she was already looking at her watch. I have to go, she said, and a second later her heels were clicking on the path to the garage. Xavier was left alone in the silence of the kitchen. He finished his coffee, but the taste seemed bitter. Something in Thalia's behavior, her absent-minded gaze, haste caught me like a thorn. He shook his head, pushing away the thoughts. She's just tired, he told himself, turning back to the presentation. Xavier's office was located in downtown Portland, in a modern building with a green roof and glass walls. His company, Greenforge Solutions, was his pride. In 10 years, he turned the startup into a market leader in environmentally friendly materials. Today's meeting with investors from Silicon Valley could bring a contract to build an entire residential complex in San Francisco. He was standing at the window of his office, looking out over the city, when his assistant, Clara, a woman of about 50 with an unfailing good-natured smile, entered. Mr. Lawrence, the investors are already in the conference room, she said, holding out a folder with documents. Are you ready to conquer the world? Xavier laughed as he accepted the folder. Clara always knew how to diffuse the situation. If they sign the contract, I'll think about conquering the galaxy, he replied, straightening his jacket. Thank you, Clara. 3 men in expensive suits were waiting for him in the conference room, with faces that betrayed a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Xavier turned on the projector, and his voice sounded confident, but with a slight charisma that always endeared people. He talked about a new composition of concrete that reduced carbon emissions by 40%, showed graphs, and answered questions. An hour later, one of the investors, a man with gray temples, nodded and said, Impressive, Lawrence. If your figures are confirmed, we are ready to talk about hundreds of millions. Xavier smiled, but inside he felt only a slight satisfaction. Success in business had long ceased to be a challenge for him. It was a routine, a well-oiled mechanism. The real joy was at home, with Thalia and Lillian, or at least that's how it used to be. Talia sat in her office at the law firm Kane and Associates, staring at her computer screen, but her mind was elsewhere. A stack of reports that needed to be reviewed lay untouched. She twisted the handle in her fingers until it slipped and fell to the floor. Thalia cursed under her breath and bent down to pick it up when Darius Kane appeared in the doorway. Bad day. His voice was deep, with a slight mockery, but his eyes looked carefully, as if scanning her. Darius, with his well-groomed beard and athletic build, looked like a man who always knew what he wanted. Thalia straightened up, straightening her hair. Her heart beat a little faster, but she forced herself to smile. "It's just a lot of work," she answered, trying to sound casual. "You know how it happens before a quarterly report." Darius stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He leaned against the edge of her desk, and his proximity made Thalia tense. "You work too much, Thalia," he said, lowering his voice. "Maybe we should take a break? Dinner tonight at Le Pierre? I know you need a distraction." Thalia opened her mouth to refuse, but something in his gaze, a mixture of confidence and challenge, silenced her. She knew this was a bad idea. She loved Xavier, she loved Lillian. But in recent months, the house seemed to her like a cage, where she was only a wife and mother, and not a woman who once dreamed of conquering the world. "I'll think about it," she finally said, looking away. Darius smiled, as if he had already received consent, and left, leaving a trail of expensive cologne behind him. Thalia squeezed the handle so hard her knuckles turned white. She knew she was making a mistake, but part of her wanted to feel alive. Xavier returned home at 7 in the evening, tired but happy. Investors promised to sign a contract after checking the data, which meant another step towards expanding the company. He expected Talia to be home already, but the kitchen was empty, and there was a note on the table. "I'm late at work. Dinner is in the refrigerator. Kisses, T." He frowned, but decided not to attach any importance to it. The waste was often delayed, especially in recent months. Instead of dinner, he poured himself a whiskey and went up to his office to check his mail. Lillian sat in her room, listening to music through her headphones and drawing something in her sketchbook. "Hey, Lil," Xavier knocked on the open door. "How was your day?" She took off her headphones and shrugged. Her face was paler than usual, and there were shadows under her eyes. "Fine. The art teacher said that my painting could go to a city exhibition." "This is cool." Xavier sat down on the edge of her bed. "Will you show me?" Lillian hesitated, but then opened her sketchbook. On the page was a drawn figure of a girl standing in the middle of a dark forest, with red smears that looked like blood around her. Xavier felt something tighten in his chest. "It's strong," he said carefully. "What inspired you?" Lillian closed her sketchbook and looked away. "Don't know. Just a mood." Xavier wanted to ask more, but his phone vibrated. Message from Clara. "The partners want to meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. Prepare materials." He sighed and began to type his reply, feeling the moment with his daughter slipping away. "Dad, are you and Mom okay?" Lillian suddenly asked. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Xavier froze, his fingers hovering over the screen. He looked at his daughter, trying to understand what was behind this question. "Of course, Lil. Why are you asking?" She shrugged, but her eyes were full of worry. "It's just, Mom is kind of strange. And you too." Xavier forced himself to smile, even though Lillian's words touched something inside him. "It's okay, honey. Adults are sometimes just busy. But we love you, you know." Lillian nodded, but her gaze remained heavy. She put on her headphones and returned to her sketchbook, shutting out the world. Xavier left the room, feeling the silence of the house become almost tangible. Late that evening, when Thalia finally returned, Xavier was sitting in the living room with a book he wasn't reading. She walked in, throwing her purse on the sofa, and smiled, but her smile was forced. "Long day?" he asked, trying to sound neutral. "Terrible," she replied, taking off her jacket. Darius flooded me with reports, and clients demanded the impossible. Xavier nodded, but Darius's name, spoken so casually, left an unpleasant aftertaste. He watched Talia go to the bathroom and noticed that her phone was left on the couch. The screen lit up with a notification and Xavier glanced at it without knowing why. The message was from DK. Today was great. Shall we repeat? His heart skipped a beat. He went to unlock the phone, but Thalia came out of the bathroom and he quickly looked away. Are you okay? She asked, noticing his tense face. Yes, just tired, he answered, getting up. I'll go to bed. Thalia nodded, but her gaze was wary. Xavier climbed the stairs, feeling something heavy and unclear growing in his chest. He went to bed, but sleep did not come. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, replaying a message in his head that he shouldn't have seen. The next morning, Xavier woke up before anyone else. He stood at the window, looking at the forest behind the house, where the first rays of the sun were breaking through the fog. Thalia was asleep. Lillian had not yet gotten up. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer seemed comfortable. It was like the calm before the storm, and Xavier felt that the storm was already close. He poured himself some coffee and opened his laptop, but instead of working, he started searching the internet for signs of cheating. The articles were full of platitudes. Your partner has become secretive. Frequent delays at work. Xavier closed the tab, feeling stupid, but the message from DK, I couldn't get it out of my head. He knew he should talk to Thalia, but his pride or fear of hearing the truth kept him in place. Today was another meeting with investors, and Xavier forced himself to concentrate. He couldn't let personal problems ruin what he'd spent years building. But as he left the house, he glanced at Thalia, who was drinking coffee at the table, and noticed how she quickly put her phone away when he entered. See you in the evening, he said, trying not to show his emotions. Aha, she answered without looking up. The morning in the Lawrence house began with the usual bustle. Xavier Lawrence, still feeling a little triumphant from yesterday's investor meeting, sat at the kitchen island, going through emails. His dark blue jacket hung over the back of his chair, and his tie was casually loosened, a rare moment when he allowed himself to relax. Outside, the Portland forest was covered in morning fog, and the silence was broken only by the sound of Lillian's spoon as she lazily stirred the yogurt. Thalia entered the kitchen, ready for the day at work. A black sheath dress emphasized her slender figure, and her heels clicked softly on the oak floor. She tossed her purse onto the countertop and reached for her coffee mug, but her movements were a little harsher than usual. Xavier looked up from the screen, catching her tension, but did not have time to say anything. Lillian beat him to it. Mom, have you forgotten about my exhibition again? The daughter's voice was even, but there was resentment in it. She put down her spoon and looked at Thalia, waiting for an answer. Talia froze, her hand with the mug frozen in the air. She turned to Lillian, and a smile flashed across her face, which seemed too forced to Xavier. Lil, I told you I'd try, she replied, trying to sound soft. Our company is in complete chaos right now. But I will do everything to be there, I promise. Lillian just nodded, but her eyes darkened. She grabbed her sketchbook and backpack, muttered something like, bye, and walked out, slamming the door. Xavier looked at Thalia, expecting her to say something about her daughter's reaction, but she had already turned away, pouring coffee. She's worried, Xavier finally said, closing his laptop. Maybe we should make time for her? Thalia sighed, her fingers gripping the mug a little tighter. I'm trying, Xavier. But you know how it is at work now. Darius demands that everyone be 100%, and I can't let him down. Darius's name, spoken so casually, cut Xavier like a blade. He remembered the message from DK that flashed on her phone screen. He wanted to ask, but pride or fear held him back. I understand, he said instead, standing up. But Lillian needs a mother, not promises. Thalia looked at him, her green eyes narrowed, but she remained silent. A second later, she grabbed her purse and left, saying as she went, See you in the evening. Xavier was left alone, feeling something heavy growing in his chest. He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts away, and headed to his office to prepare for another meeting. During the day, Xavier was in the office, but his thoughts kept returning to Thalia. The meeting with his partners went smoothly. They confirmed their interest in the contract. But even this could not distract him from his vague anxiety. Clara, his assistant, noticed his absent-mindedness when she served him coffee. "Mr. Lawrence, you are not in business today," she said with a slight smile, putting the cup on the table. "Everything is fine?" Xavier leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Just family matters, Clara. Nothing serious." She nodded, but her gaze was full of sympathy. "Family is always difficult, but you can handle it. You always manage." Xavier forced himself to smile, but Clara's words did not calm him down. He opened his laptop to check the reports, but instead his fingers hovered over the keyboard. He suddenly remembered how Talia hid the phone yesterday when he entered the living room. This gesture, so small, now seemed to him to be a signal of something larger. He shook his head and went back to work, but the anxiety remained, like a shadow that could not be shaken off. The evening found Xavier at home, in the living room, where he leafed through a magazine without reading the text. Lillian was at home, immersed in music and drawing, and Thalia had not yet returned. Xavier glanced at his watch, 7:30. He wrote her a message. "Where are you? Lil is expecting you for dinner." The answer came 10 minutes later. "I'm delayed, client dinner. I'll be there soon." Xavier frowned, but decided not to answer. Instead, he stood up to grab a bottle of water from the kitchen and noticed Thalia's purse carelessly tossed on the couch. She apparently dropped by home during the day, but he didn't notice. The handbag was slightly open, and the corner of a velvet box was sticking out of it. Xavier froze. He knew he shouldn't pry into her things, but something instinct, curiosity, suspicion pushed him forward. He carefully pulled out the box and opened it. Inside was a brooch, gold, with an emerald in the center, obviously expensive, the kind that Talia could not buy with her salary. His heart began to pound. He closed the box and returned it to its place, but his thoughts were already racing. When Thalia returned, around 9, Xavier was sitting in the living room, pretending to read. She entered, throwing her purse on the same sofa, and smiled, but her smile was forced, as if she knew that he had noticed her lateness. "Long day?" he asked, trying to sound calm, but his voice was colder than he intended. "Very," Thalia replied, taking off her jacket. "Darius hosted a dinner with clients and had to stay. These people are so demanding, you have no idea." Xavier nodded, but his eyes fell on the purse. He couldn't help himself. "By the way, I saw the brooch in your bag," he said, watching her reaction. "Beautiful. Where?" Thalia froze, her hand reaching for a glass of water frozen in the air. She turned to him, and her face showed panic for a second, but she quickly pulled herself together. "Oh, this?" She laughed, but the laughter was too harsh. "A gift from a colleague. We had a company anniversary, and they were giving away all sorts of little things. Nothing special." Xavier looked at her, feeling a coldness growing in his chest. The brooch did not look like a trifle, and her nervousness, her hasty tone, it was all wrong. "A colleague, then," he said, getting up. "A generous gesture." Thalia nodded, but her eyes avoided his gaze. She muttered something about the shower and went upstairs, leaving Xavier alone. He stood looking at the purse and felt something shrinking inside. He wanted to believe her. "I wanted everything to be as she said." But her words sounded like lies, and the thought was as sharp as a knife. Later, as the house fell silent, Xavier sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen. He wasn't working, he was just staring at the dark screen, trying to sort out his thoughts. Thalia was in the bedroom, probably already asleep. He thought about the brooch, about her lateness, about the message from DK. He knew that Darius Kane was her boss, a man with a reputation who could afford expensive gifts. But the idea that Talia could. No, he didn't even want to formulate it. He opened his browser and, without knowing why, typed Kane and Associates into the search engine. The company's website was impeccable. Photos of the team, customer reviews, a portrait of Darius in an expensive suit, with a confident smile. Xavier closed the tab, feeling like an idiot. But then his gaze fell on the phone lying on the table. He remembered how Thalia hid her phone when he walked in yesterday. Xavier stood up and quietly walked into the living room. Her phone was charging. The screen was dark. He took it, feeling his heart pounding. He knew her password, Lillian's birthday. But when he tried to unlock it, the screen showed a Face ID request. Talia changed her password. For the first time in years of marriage, he put the phone back and returned to the office, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. It didn't prove anything, he told himself. People change passwords. This is fine. But inside he knew that this was not normal. Not for Thalia, who always left her phone open, who trusted him. The next morning, Xavier woke up with a heavy head. Talia had already left for work, leaving a note. Left early, meeting. Kiss. Lillian was sitting at breakfast, scrolling through something on her phone. Xavier sat down opposite him, trying to look normal. Lil, are you okay? He asked, pouring himself some coffee. She shrugged, not looking up from the screen. Fine. And you? Xavier wanted to tell her about his doubts, but stopped. She was a child. She shouldn't have been involved. Instead, he smiled. Everything is fine. Ready for another day of conquering the world. Lillian snorted, but her smile was warm. For a moment, Xavier felt relieved. No matter what happened to Thalia, Lillian was here, and he wouldn't let anything destroy their family. But when he left the house, his gaze fell on Thalia's car parked at the neighboring house. She said she left early, but the car was here. He samer, feeling the cold creeping under his skin. Perhaps she took a taxi. Maybe it doesn't mean anything. But his mind was already drawing pictures that he did not want to see. Xavier got into his SUV and drove to the office, but all the way he was haunted by one thought. He must find out the truth, and he will find a way, even if it breaks his heart. Talia Lawrence sat at her desk in the Kane and Associates office, staring at the computer screen where a spreadsheet of financial statements blurred before her eyes. Outside, Portland was bathed in the gray light of late morning, and the sound of rain drowned out the hum of voices in the open space. Her fingers froze over the keyboard, and her thoughts were far from the numbers. She was still replaying her conversation with Xavier yesterday, his cold tone when he asked about the brooch, and her own lies that came out too easily. Talia squeezed the pen until it cracked and threw it onto the table. Is everything okay, Thalia? The voice of her colleague, Emma, pulled her out of her thoughts. Emma, a red-haired woman in her 30s, stood at her desk with a mug of tea, her eyebrows slightly raised. Thalia forced herself to smile, straightening her hair. Yeah, just. A lot of work, she answered, trying to sound casual. This report for the client seems to be written in Chinese. Emma laughed, but her gaze was attentive. Understand. Darius has been chasing everyone around lately. But you are his star. You can handle it. Thalia nodded, but the word star left a bitter taste. She knew that Darius Kane, her boss, singled her out his compliments, his smiles, his offers to discuss the project over coffee were too frequent to be simply professional. And yesterday, when he gave her that brooch, she felt like the thin line between flirting and something more began to blur. She returned to the table, but a few minutes later her phone vibrated. Message from Darius. Come see me at 11. Need to discuss a report for the Hendersons. Thalia looked at her watch, 10:45. Her heart began to pound, and she hated herself for it. She stood up, straightened her dress, and headed towards his office, trying to ignore the looks of her colleagues. Darius's office was on the top floor, with a panoramic view of the city. The walls were decorated with diplomas and photographs of influential clients, and Darius himself sat at a massive dark wood desk, looking through papers. His black hair was neatly styled, and his beard accentuated his sharp features. When Thalia entered, he looked up and smiled, that smile that always made her feel both wanted and vulnerable. Thalia, good to see you, he said, leaning back in his chair. Take a seat. Coffee? No, thank you, she replied, sitting down opposite him. Her voice was calm, but her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of the folder she had brought. Did you want to discuss the report? Darius nodded, but his eyes slid over her, lingering on her neck, where she pinned that very brooch. Thalia felt her cheeks begin to burn and regretted wearing it today. Yes, a report, he said, but his tone was too light, almost playful. But first tell me, how do you like the gift? I noticed you were wearing it. Thalia swallowed, her fingers involuntarily touching the brooch. He's handsome, she said, trying not to meet his gaze. But Darius, it was too much. I'm not sure I can accept such a gift. He laughed. His laugh was deep, almost velvety. Thalia, relax. It's just a gesture of gratitude. You do more for the company than anyone else. Consider it a bonus. She nodded, but Xavier's words about a generous colleague echoed in her head. She wanted to change the subject, but Darius beat her to it. You know, you look amazing today, he said, leaning a little closer. This dress, it's like it was made for you. Talia felt the blood rush to her face. She knew she should stop him, tell him it was inappropriate, but something in his voice, the confidence, the attention silenced her. At home, Xavier rarely noticed her outfits and rarely complimented her. And Darius, he saw her, and it was intoxicating. Thank you, she muttered, looking away, but let's talk about the report. What needs to be improved? Darius smiled as if he knew he had won this round. He opened the folder and began to talk about numbers, but his tone was absent-minded, and his eyes kept returning to her. Thalia tried to concentrate, but her thoughts were confused. She felt like a teenager caught doing something forbidden, and it scared her. By the end of the day, Thalia was exhausted. The report was ready, but her nerves were on edge. She was sitting in her office, looking at the screen, when Darius appeared in the doorway again. His jacket was unbuttoned and his shirt was slightly wrinkled, a rare look for him that made him look less intimidating but still dangerously attractive. Thalia, are you still here? He asked, leaning on the doorframe. I thought you had already run home. She smiled, but the smile was weak. I'm trying to finish everything before tomorrow, she replied, closing the laptop. What are you doing? Are you tired after today? Darius stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Thalia tensed, but tried not to show it. I'm tired, he admitted, sitting down on the edge of her table. But you know, sometimes you need a distraction. I was wondering if we could have dinner today. At Le Pierre, they serve amazing steak, and the wine is just as good. Thalia froze. She knew it wasn't just dinner. She knew she had to refuse, say that she had a family, that she couldn't. But there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate, a mixture of challenge and promise that this evening would be special. Darius, she began, but he interrupted. Thalia, this is not a business meeting, he said, lowering his voice. Just two people who are tired of work and want to have a good time. No obligation. Her heart began to pound. She thought about Xavier, about his cold tone yesterday, about Lillian, who looked at her with resentment. But she also thought about herself, the woman who had once dreamed of more than just being a wife and mother. And this woman, buried under the burden of routine, suddenly wanted to feel alive. Okay, she said quietly, almost in a whisper, but only dinner. Darius smiled, and there was something predatory in his smile. Only dinner, he repeated, getting up. Meet me at 7. I'll book a table. When he left, Thalia was left alone, feeling her stomach tighten. She knew she was making a mistake, but she couldn't stop. Le Pierre was one of those restaurants where everything exudes luxury. Crystal chandeliers, soft candlelight, waiters who moved like shadows. Thalia walked in, feeling out of place, despite the elegant black dress she had chosen from her wardrobe. Darius was already waiting for her at a table by the window, with a glass of wine in his hand. He stood up as she approached, and his gaze swept over her with undisguised admiration. You look like a dream, he said, pulling out a chair for her. Thalia smiled, but her smile was nervous. You're always like this, she replied, sitting down. Aren't you tired? He laughed, sitting down opposite. Only when I see someone who deserves it. The dinner started innocently. They talked about work, about clients, about how Darius once almost failed a deal due to an incorrect calculation. Thalia laughed, feeling the tension release. The wine was smooth, the food was delicious, and Darius was the perfect conversationalist, attentive, witty, charming. But as the evening progressed, their conversation became more personal. "Tell me about yourself, Thalia," he said, leaning closer. "Not about work. About what you want. Do you dream of something other than these endless reports?" Talia hesitated, twirling the glass in her fingers. She wasn't used to talking about herself. Xavier rarely asked, and Lillian was too young to understand. I, I don't know," she admitted. "I used to want to travel and see the world. Maybe right. But then Lillian appeared, and life changed." Darius nodded, his eyes serious. "Life changes us," he said. "But that doesn't mean dreams die. You can still get them back." Thalia looked at him, and there was something in his words that touched her. She felt her defenses crumble, how she wanted to believe him. And when he touched her hand, his fingers were warm, confident. She did not pull away. "You are special, Thalia," he said quietly, "and you deserve more than to be just someone's wife or mother." Her throat tightened. She knew she should leave, say it was too much, but instead she stayed. Their conversation became more and more intimate, their glances became longer, and their touches became bolder. When Darius offered to give her a ride home, she agreed, even though she knew it was more than just a ride. The silence was heavy in Darius' car parked outside her house. Thalia looked out the window, her heart pounding. She knew she had to go out, but she didn't move. "Thank you for the evening," she finally said, turning to him. "It was good." Darius smiled, but his gaze was dark, almost hungry. "This is just the beginning, Thalia," he said, leaning closer. She could have stopped him. I could have said no. But instead, she let him kiss her, and that kiss was like falling, frightening but liberating. When she finally got out of the car, her legs were shaking and my head was in chaos. She knew she had gone too far, but part of her didn't want to go back. Thalia entered the house quietly, careful not to wake Xavier or Lillian. She took off her shoes and walked into the bathroom, looking at her reflection in the mirror. Her lips were still burning from the kiss, and her eyes were full of guilt. She told herself that it was a one-time thing, that she would stop. But deep down she knew it was a lie. Lillian Lawrence sat in the back seat of the school bus, her forehead pressed against the cool glass. Outside the window flashed the wet streets of Portland, covered with a gray coating of rain. Her headphones hummed with a quiet melody, something indie, with dreary guitar chords, but she barely listened. Her fingers clutched the sketchbook lying on her lap, and her thoughts swirled around last night. Her mother's hasty smile, her father's silence, their strained glances. Something was wrong, and this feeling, like a splinter, did not give peace. The bus stopped at the school, and Lillian, picking up her backpack, wandered towards the building. Her sneakers splashed through the puddles, and her sweater, too large for her thin figure, was wet on her shoulders. She didn't take the umbrella not because she forgot, but because she didn't care. At school, among the hubbub of her classmates and the smell of wet clothes, she felt even more alone. In art class, her favorite class, Lillian sat at an easel in the corner. Miss Harper, a teacher with long gray hair and kind eyes, gave them an assignment: draw something that reflected their mood. Lillian opened her sketchbook and started drawing without thinking. Her pencil moved quickly, leaving sharp lines on the paper. A dark forest, the figure of a girl in the center, surrounded by scarlet strokes that looked like blood. She didn't know why she chose this, but with every stroke her chest tightened more. "Lillian, this is impressive." Miss Harper's voice came over her shoulder. The teacher leaned over, looking at the drawing. "But it's a little gloomy, don't you think?" Lillian shrugged, not looking up from her paper. "Just the mood," she muttered, adding another stroke of red gouache. Miss Harper sat down next to her, her gaze soft but wary. "Are you okay, Lil? The last couple of weeks you've been kind of not yourself." Lillian tensed. She hated it when adults asked such questions. They always expected an honest answer, but were rarely ready to hear it. "It's okay," she said, trying to sound indifferent. "I'm just tired." Miss Harper nodded, but her eyes said she didn't believe it. If you want to talk, you know where to find me, she said, patting Lillian on the shoulder, and walked away to another student. Lillian looked at her drawing. The girl on the paper looked lost, as if the forest was swallowing her up. She suddenly thought about her mother, about how Thalia came back late yesterday, smelling of wine and something else unfamiliar, and about Dad, who looked at her with such coldness that Lillian had never seen before. She closed her sketchbook, feeling her throat tighten. At home, after school, Lillian sat in her room, cross-legged on the bed. Her room was her sanctuary. The walls were covered with sketches, there were art books on the shelf, and in the corner there was an old easel that her dad gave her for her 13th birthday. She leafed through her sketchbook, but didn't draw. Her hands wouldn't obey. Instead, she turned up the music, hoping to drown out her thoughts. The door creaked and Thalia entered the room. She was dressed in loungewear yoga pants and a loose t-shirt, but her hair was still pulled back into a neat bun, as if she couldn't quite relax. Lillian took off her headphones and looked at her mother, waiting for what she would say. "Hey, Lil," Thalia smiled, but her smile was forced, as if she was forcing herself to be cheerful. "How was your day?" Lillian shrugged, fiddling with the corner of her sketchbook. "Fine. And you?" Thalia sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. "Oh, work is a nightmare," she said, rolling her eyes. "Darius has bombarded me with new projects, and the clients are so picky. But I can handle it." Lillian nodded, but the word Darius cut her. She had heard that name too often lately. Her mother mentioned it in almost every conversation, and every time her voice sounded strange. It was as if she was trying to justify herself. "Mom, will you come to my exhibition?" Lillian asked, looking at her mother. Her voice was quiet, but there was hope in it. Thalia hesitated, her fingers gripping the hem of her t-shirt. "Lil, I'm really trying," she said, looking away. "But we have a company event on Friday, and Darius said it was important. I'll try to break free, I promise." Lillian felt something tighten in her chest. She wanted to scream, to say that she was tired of this phrase, "I'll try." But instead, she just nodded. "Okay," she muttered, putting her headphones back on. Thalia looked at her for a second, as if she wanted to add something, but then she stood up and left, quietly closing the door. Lillian stared at the ceiling, feeling tears sting her eyes. She didn't cry, she didn't want to. Instead, she opened her sketchbook and began to draw, pouring out her pain onto the paper. That evening, when Xavier returned home, Lillian was in the living room, lying on the sofa with her phone. He looked tired, his jacket was thrown carelessly on a chair, and his tie hung around his neck like a noose. Lillian noticed that his eyes were red, as if he had not slept. "Hi, Lil," he said, sitting down next to her. "Where is Mom?" "Upstairs," Lillian answered, without looking up from the screen. She said she was tired. Xavier nodded, but his gaze was heavy. He rubbed his temples as if trying to get rid of a headache. "How are you, honey?" he asked, looking at her. "Is something wrong?" Lillian hesitated. She wanted to tell him about her mother's lateness, about how she avoids her, about her drawings, which are becoming darker and darker. But she was afraid that he wouldn't understand, or worse, that he would confirm her fears. "It's okay," she said, shrugging. "Just school, Xavier smiled, but his smile was forced. "I know," he said, patting her on the shoulder. "If anything happens, I'm always here, Lil." She nodded, but her heart sank. She wanted to believe him, but something in his voice tension said that he himself was not okay. The next day at school, Miss Harper detained Lillian after class. She sat at her desk, surrounded by paints and brushes, and her face was serious. "Lillian, I wanted to talk about your drawing," she said, opening her sketchbook. "He's very strong, but he worries me. Do you want to tell us what inspired you?" Lillian tensed, her fingers tightening on the strap of her backpack. "It's just a drawing," she said, trying to sound indifferent. "Nothing special." Miss Harper looked at her, her eyes full of sympathy. "Lil, I know you're talented," she said softly. "But art often reflects what's inside us. If something happens at home, with friends, you can tell me. I won't tell anyone. Lillian felt her throat tighten. She wanted to talk about how Mom always disappears somewhere, how Dad became a stranger, how she feels invisible. But the words stuck, and she just shook her head. It's okay, she said, looking away. Can I go? Miss Harper sighed, but nodded. Certainly. But Lillian, if you change your mind, I'm here. Lillian left the classroom, feeling her cheeks heat up. She hated this feeling when someone saw her pain, but she couldn't explain it. In the hallway, she stopped at the window, looking at the rain, and thought about how everything had changed. Her family, who had once been her support, now seemed fragile, like glass, ready to crack under the slightest pressure. That night, Lillian lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her room was dark, only the light of the moon came through the curtains. She could hear her parents talking downstairs, their voices quiet but intense. She couldn't make out the words, but Xavier's tone was cold, and Thalia's answers were short, almost sharp. Lillian clutched her pillow, feeling fear grip her heart. She stood up and walked over to the table where her sketchbook lay. Opening it, she looked at the last drawing: a dark forest, a girl, blood. She took a pencil and began adding details. The shadows that surrounded the figure became thicker, and her face became more and more like her mother's. Lillian didn't know why she was drawing it, but every stroke was like a scream that she couldn't let go. When she finished, her hands were shaking. She closed the sketchbook and lay back down, but sleep did not come. Instead, she thought about what was happening to her family and how scared she was to find out the truth. Xavier Lawrence stood at the window of his office, looking out onto the wet streets of Portland. The rain pattered on the glass, drowning out the roar of the city, but not his thoughts. The last days were like a shadow hanging over him. The brooch in Talia's bag, her nervous glances, the changed password on the phone. Every time he tried to convince himself that it didn't mean anything, a new piece of the puzzle, the message from DK, her late returns, destroyed his reasoning. He clenched his fists, feeling something heavy, almost suffocating, growing in his chest. Mr. Lawrence? The voice of Clara, his assistant, pulled him out of his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, holding a folder. Partners from Seattle have confirmed a meeting for the day after tomorrow. I have booked your flight and hotel. Everything is fine. Xavier turned, forcing himself to smile. Clara, with her unfailing goodwill, was one of the few who could break through his armor. Everything is fine, Clara. Thank you, he said, accepting the folder. What's the time there? Departure on Wednesday morning, back on Friday, she answered, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer. Are you sure everything is okay? You are somehow not here today. Xavier chuckled, but the laugh came out dry. There's just a lot to do, he said, looking away. Family, work. You know how it goes. Clara nodded, but her eyes were full of sympathy. I know. But if anything happens, I can always order you a stronger coffee. She winked and left, leaving him alone. Xavier sat down at his desk, but instead of opening the folder, he stared at the laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He knew he had to prepare for a business trip. A meeting in Seattle could land his company a contract to supply materials for a tech firm's new campus. But thoughts about Talia, about her lies, about Darius Kane haunted her. He felt like an idiot for rummaging through her bag, checking her phone, but he felt even more of an idiot for ignoring the obvious. He opened his browser and, almost unconsciously, typed into the search, "How to find out if your partner is cheating." The articles were banal. Look out for changes in behavior. Check your phone, but one phrase stuck with him. If you can't trust, install hidden cameras. Xavier froze. The idea seemed wild, almost treacherous. But the longer he thought, the more it seemed like the only way to find out the truth. He clicked on a link to a website selling spy equipment. Button-sized cameras, Wi-Fi-connected audio devices, remote access apps. He read the descriptions, feeling his stomach tighten. This was wrong. This was an invasion of Thalia's personal space, of their family. But then he remembered her voice when she talked about the brooch, too hasty, too false. And determination, like cold steel, grew stronger in him. Xavier chose a kit. 3 mini cameras and 2 audio devices. He placed an order for delivery the next day, indicating the office address so that Talia would not find out. Closing the site, he leaned back in his chair, feeling his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he was doing was right, but he knew he couldn't live in ignorance any longer. At home in the evening, Xavier tried to behave as usual. Lillian was in her room, immersed in music, and Thalia was preparing dinner, a rare occasion when she was home on time. The smell of fried chicken and rosemary filled the kitchen, and Xavier sat at the island with a glass of wine, watching her. She moved confidently, but her shoulders were tense and her smile was too quick, as if she was afraid that he would ask something unnecessary. "How was the meeting?" Thalia asked, not turning around as she chopped vegetables. "Okay," Xavier replied, twirling the glass in his fingers. "The partners are happy. If everything works out, it will be a big contract." She nodded, but her gaze was distracted. "This is cool," she said, her voice almost mechanical. "You always get your way." Xavier frowned. There was no warmth in her words, only something similar to fatigue. He wanted to ask what was wrong with her, but instead he said, "How are you doing? Is Darius still keeping you busy with work?" Darius's name came out on its own, and Xavier immediately regretted it. Thalia froze, her knife stopping over the carrot. She turned and her eyes narrowed for a second, but she quickly smiled. "Yes, as usual," she replied, returning to cutting. "He demands that everything be perfect. But I can handle it." Xavier nodded, but his gaze fell on her hands. She gripped the knife a little tighter than necessary. He wanted to ask about the brooch, about her phone, about everything that tormented him, but Lillian went down to the kitchen, interrupting the moment. "It smells delicious," she said, sitting down at the table. Her long hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she was holding a sketchbook in her hands. "Dad, will you be at the exhibition?" Xavier smiled, grateful for the change of topic. "Of course, Lil. I promised. Will you show your paintings?" Lillian nodded, but her gaze slid to her mother. "Mom, what about you?" Thalia turned around, drying her hands with a towel. Her smile was forced. "I'll try, honey, but we have an important event at the company on Friday. I'll do everything I can." Lillian lowered her eyes, and Xavier felt irritation boil within him. He knew Thalia was busy, but her constant "I'll try" sounded like a refusal. He wanted to say something, but Lillian had already buried her face in her sketchbook, cutting herself off from them. Dinner passed in silence, interrupted only by the clatter of forks. Xavier looked at Thalia and her distant face and felt the distance between them growing. He thought about the cameras that would arrive tomorrow and that perhaps he would soon find out the truth. This thought both frightened and calmed him. The next day, Xavier received a package at the office. He waited until Clara left for lunch and opened the box in his office. The cameras were tiny, almost invisible, with instructions promising easy installation and remote access. The audio devices resembled USB drives that could be hidden in an outlet. Xavier read the instructions, feeling his heart clench. He could still refuse, return the package, and talk to Talia. But then he remembered her lies about the brooch, her evasive answers, and his resolve strengthened. At home, while Talia was at work and Lillian at school, Xavier began the installation. He felt like a thief in his own home, moving quietly as if afraid that someone was watching him. He installed the first camera in the living room, hiding it in a decorative frame on a shelf. The second one is in the corridor at the entrance, disguised as part of a lamp. He placed the third in their bedroom, in the corner of the bookcase, where it was almost invisible. He plugged audio devices into outlets in the living room and bedroom, syncing them with an app on his phone. Every movement felt like a betrayal. He imagined Thalia recognizing him, looking at him with pain and anger. But then he remembered her phone number, her lateness, her lies, and continued. When everything was ready, he checked the application the cameras were working, transmitting a clear image. He turned off the phone, feeling his hands shaking. In the evening, when Talia returned, Xavier tried not to look at the places where he hid the cameras. She was distracted as usual and went straight to the bathroom, leaving her phone on the kitchen island. Xavier looked at him, but didn't touch him. He had already taken a step from which there was no return. "Are you okay?" Thalia asked as she came out of the bathroom. Her hair was damp and her face was tired. "Yes," he answered, trying to sound natural. "I'm just thinking about a business trip. I'm leaving for Seattle tomorrow." She nodded, but her gaze was blank. "Good luck," she said, and her voice was almost indifferent. Xavier watched her go upstairs and felt his heart clench. He knew the business trip would give him a chance to check the records, but the thought of what he might find filled him with fear. He wanted to believe that he was wrong, that Thalia was just tired, that their family was still intact. But deep down, he felt that the truth would be different. The morning before departure, Xavier went into Lillian's room. She was asleep, her sketchbook lying on the floor, open to a page with a dark drawing. He looked at her, feeling the pain growing in his chest. No matter what happened, he had to protect her. He quietly left, leaving a note. "Lil, I'll be back on Friday. I love you. Dad." At the airport, sitting in the waiting room, Xavier opened the application on his phone. The cameras showed an empty house. Living room, corridor, bedroom. He closed the app, feeling his stomach tighten. He wasn't ready to watch. Not yet. But he knew that he would have to soon. The plane took off, taking him to Seattle, but Xavier felt like he was leaving behind not only his home, but the life he knew. And no matter what he finds on those recordings, there will be no turning back. Xavier Lawrence sat in his Seattle hotel room, staring at his laptop screen, where he had a presentation open for tomorrow's meeting. Outside the window, the city sparkled with lights, but he barely noticed it. His thoughts were far away in Portland in their home, where the truth he was so afraid to know was now perhaps unfolding. His phone lay on the table dark, but seemed to radiate menace. The camera recording app was just one tap away, and the thought churned his stomach. The business trip started well. His partners from the technology company greeted him warmly, and preliminary negotiations went smoothly. But even success could not drown out the internal noise. The brooch, the changed password, Thalia's evasive answers, all this was spinning in his head like a broken record. He tried to concentrate on his work, but every time his eyes fell on the phone, he felt his determination fighting with his fear. Xavier poured himself a whiskey from the minibar, hoping the alcohol would dull his nerves. He took a sip, but the taste was as bitter as his thoughts. He knew he had to check the records. He didn't install the cameras to ignore them. But the thought that he might see, or worse, see nothing, and then his suspicions would turn out to be paranoia was almost unbearable. He put the glass down and picked up the phone. His finger hovered over the app icon. "You should know," he told himself, but the voice in his head sounded uncertain. He took a deep breath and pressed. The app opened, showing 3 live feeds: living room, hallway, bedroom. The house was empty, lit only by the soft light of the lamps. Xavier felt relief mixed with disappointment. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe Talia is just at work and Lillian is at school. But then he noticed the posts tab. The cameras recorded everything that happened while he was on the road. His heart began to pound. He clicked on a recording from the living room, dated earlier this morning. The screen showed a familiar room, a sofa, a coffee table, a shelf with books. A minute later, Talia appeared in the frame. She was dressed in loungewear yoga pants and a t-shirt, but her hair was down and she had a slight smile on her face. She was talking on the phone, her voice was muffled, but Xavier caught snippets. "Yes, I'm free. Of course, come." He froze, his fingers clutching the phone. Talia ended the call and left the frame, but a few minutes later, the recording showed the front door opening. Darius Kane entered the living room. His dark jacket was unbuttoned, and on his face was the same confident smile that Xavier had seen on his company's website. Thalia reappeared and her smile widened. She walked up to Darius, and they hugged not as colleagues, but as people who had long since crossed this line. Xavier felt the blood pounding in his temples. He wanted to close the application, but his hand did not move. On the recording, Darius said something and Thalia laughed, her hand touching his chest. They sat down on the sofa, too close, and their conversation became quieter, more intimate. Xavier increased the volume, but the words were unintelligible. He didn't need words. Their gestures, their glances said everything. He switched to the bedroom recording, his fingers trembling. The camera showed an empty room, but a few minutes later Thalia and Darius entered. She closed the door and Xavier felt his world crumble. Darius pulled her to him, and their kiss was long, greedy. Thalia didn't resist her arms wrapped around his neck, and his fingers slid under her t-shirt. The recording cut off as they fell onto the bed, but Xavier had already seen enough. He threw the phone onto the table, and it hit the laptop with a loud crash. His breathing was heavy, and a mixture of rage and pain raged in his chest. He stood up, clenching his fists, and went to the window, but the city behind the glass seemed blurry. He saw only Thalia and Darius, their bodies, their betrayal. His wife, the woman he had loved for over 10 years, the mother of his daughter, was with another man in their home, in their bedroom. Xavier returned to the table and poured more whiskey, but did not drink it. He grabbed the phone and opened the app again, as if hoping it was a mistake, that he had misunderstood something. But the recording was there, clear, inexorable. He replayed it back to the moment when Talia was talking on the phone. Her voice, now clearer, cut like a knife. Xavier is in Seattle until Friday. Yes, I want to see you. He turned off the phone and squeezed it so hard that the plastic creaked. His mind raced between rage and despair. He wanted to call Talia, scream, and demand an explanation. He wanted to rush home and surprise them, to knock that smug smile off Darius's face. But he knew that it wouldn't change anything. The truth was already in front of him, and it was worse than he could have imagined. Xavier sat on the edge of the bed, his hands shaking. He thought about Lillian, how this would destroy her. He thought about the years he and Talia had spent together, their wedding, Lillian's birth, their dreams for the future. It all seemed like a lie now. He felt humiliated, deceived, but most of all, broken. His gaze fell on the laptop, where the presentation was still open. Tomorrow's meeting now seemed absurd, insignificant, but he knew he had to control himself. He couldn't let this destroy his life, his company, his daughter. He had to act, but not on emotions. He needed a strategy. Xavier opened his laptop and began searching for information about Darius Kane. He knew that Darius was married to Eden Kane, the daughter of Senator Roland Winters. He knew that Darius had a reputation that he guarded, and he knew that this recording was a weapon that could destroy him. The thought of revenge was cold but calming. If Talia and Darius thought they could deceive him without consequences, they were wrong. He saved the recording to an encrypted cloud drive, making sure it was safe. He then texted Talia, trying to sound normal. "Everything is okay in Seattle. How are you and Lil?" The answer came a few minutes later. "Everything is fine. Lil is preparing for the exhibition. Good luck with the negotiations." Her words, so ordinary, were like a blow. She lied to him without even blinking. Xavier put his phone down and lay down on the bed, looking at the ceiling. Sleep did not come. Instead, he imagined himself returning home, looking into Thalia's eyes, making her feel the same pain that he felt. He knew he couldn't just leave his pride. His dignity demanded an answer, and he will find a way, even if it destroys them all. Eden Kane stood in the spacious living room of her mansion in the hills of Portland, her slender fingers fingering fabric samples for an upcoming charity event. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, reflecting in the crystal chandelier and emphasizing the impeccable elegance of the room. Marble fireplace, velvet sofas, paintings in gilded frames. Eden, in an ivory silk pantsuit, looked the part, with her blonde hair styled in a perfect bun and her blue eyes scanning the shades of blue and silver. "Mrs. Kane, this satin would look great with silver accents," said the event planner, Catherine, a woman in her 40s holding a clipboard. She pointed to a swatch of fabric lying on the coffee table. "And we can add live orchids for a touch of sophistication." Eden nodded, her lips slightly curved in a smile, but her gaze remained cold, calculating. "Orchids will do, but make sure they are white," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "And I want the tables to be set no later than 7. Guests should feel like they are at the event of the year." Catherine nodded vigorously, writing something down on her tablet. Of course, Mrs. Kane. Everything will be perfect. Eden put the sample down and walked to the window, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Behind the glass lay her garden, neatly trimmed bushes, a fountain, white gravel paths. This house, this garden, this evening, everything was her kingdom, which she had been building for years. As the daughter of Senator Roland Winters, she knew the value of reputation, and her marriage to Darius Kane, a star of the Portland legal world, was part of that carefully crafted image. But in recent weeks, something has gone wrong in her kingdom. Darius has become elusive. He stayed late at work, answered calls in a whisper, and left home early in the morning without saying a word. Eden chalked it up to his busy schedule. His firm was in the middle of a major deal with a technology company, and he often mentioned the pressure. But her instinct, honed by years of life in the world of politics and power, suggested that it was not just about work. She turned to Catherine, who was still flipping through the decor catalog. "Catherine, at another table for sponsors," Eden said, getting back to business. "My father will probably bring his colleagues. He wants the evening to be not only charitable, but also politically significant." Catherine nodded, her fingers running across the screen. "Understood. I'll contact Senator Winter's office to confirm the guest list." Eden smiled, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. She knew her father would be pleased. Roland Winters, with his steely character and impeccable reputation, always taught her that family is not only love, but also a union that should strengthen the position. Her marriage to Darius was just such an alliance. He had access to her connections, and she had access to his charisma and success. But if Darius puts this alliance in jeopardy, she will not remain silent. Eden walked into her office, a small but elegant corner of the house where she kept her plans and secrets. On the table lay a folder with details of the charity evening, guest list, menu, program. She opened it, but her eyes fell on a photograph in a silver frame of her and Darius at their wedding 10 years ago. She is in a white dress, he is in a tuxedo, their smiles are shining. Eden touched the frame, her fingers lingering on the glass. Then everything seemed possible. Now she wasn't so sure. Her phone vibrated, and her father's name flashed on the screen. Eden replied, her voice warming but maintaining formality. "Dad, I'm glad to hear from you," she said, sitting down at the table. "How are things in Washington?" As always, Eden, Roland Winters' voice was deep, with a slight hoarseness that betrayed years of public speaking. Politics is like chess, where all the pieces think they are kings. But that's not what I'm calling about. How's your evening going? Eden smiled, feeling his words bring her back to reality. Everything is under control. We are expecting about 200 guests, including the governor and several CEOs. The fund will raise at least $1 million for children's hospitals. "Well done," Roland said, and there was pride in his voice. "But remember, Eden, it's not just about the money. It's about reputation. Our names must be impeccable. No errors." Eden nodded, although he couldn't see her. "I know, Dad. Everything will be perfect." "How's Darius?" he asked, his tone becoming a little sharper. "Is he still busy with his deals?" Eden hesitated, her fingers clenching the handle on the table. She did not want to tell her father about her suspicions. He had always been wary of Darius, considering him too ambitious, too slippery. But she knew she couldn't lie. "He's under pressure," she said carefully. "The company is working on a large project, but he copes." Roland chuckled, and Eden could imagine his face, stern, with narrowed eyes. "Keep an eye on him, Eden," he said. "Men like Darius think they can have it all, but they're wrong. If he does anything to hurt you or our family, I will deal with him." Eden felt her throat tighten. She knew her father was serious. His influence in Oregon and beyond was enormous, and he did not tolerate betrayal. "Don't worry, Dad," she said, trying to sound confident. "Everything is under control." They said goodbye, and Eden put her phone down, feeling her shoulders tense. She didn't want to think of Darius as a problem, but his behavior, his secret calls, his aloofness haunted her. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where the gardener was trimming the roses. Her life looked perfect, but there was something wrong underneath the surface, and she couldn't ignore it forever. Darius returned home late, around 9 in the evening. Eden heard the front door slam and walked out into the hall to meet him. He was wearing a dark suit, but his tie was loose, and there was a look of weariness on his face, mixed with something else she couldn't make out. His black hair was slightly disheveled, and he smelled of expensive cologne and something else, wine, maybe. "Long day?" Eden asked, crossing her arms. Her voice was calm, but there was a slight hint of cold in it. Darius looked at her, his smile quick, almost automatic. "Very," he replied, taking off his jacket and hanging it on a hanger. "The clients are blowing their minds, and the team can't cope without my supervision." Eden nodded, but her eyes watched him carefully. She noticed how he avoided her gaze, how his hand lingered for a second on the pocket where the phone lay. "Have you eaten?" she asked, softening her tone. "I can ask Maria to heat up dinner." "No need," Darius said, heading towards the stairs. "I ate in the office. I just want to take a shower and lie down." Eden watched him rise and felt her instincts sound the alarm. She knew Darius, his way of speaking, his gestures. He was too hasty, too distant. She wanted to follow him, ask him what was going on, but instead she returned to the living room, where the tissue samples were still lying. She took one, but her thoughts were far away. Later, when Darius came down in his lounge clothes, Eden was sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine. She looked at him, trying to look casual. "Dad called," she said, watching his reaction. "He asked about you. I want you to be at the party. He said it was important for our reputation." Darius nodded, but his gaze was distracted. "Of course I will," he said, sitting down opposite. "This is your evening. I won't let you down." Eden smiled, but her smile was cold. "Okay," she said, "because you know how Dad feels about mistakes." Darius looked at her, and for a second something flashed in his eyes, anxiety, maybe, but he quickly smiled. "Don't worry, Eden. Everything will be perfect." She nodded, but her heart sank. She knew Darius was hiding something, and she would find a way to find out what it was. Her family, her reputation, were too important to let him ruin everything. Xavier Lawrence drove down the highway from the Portland airport, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The rain pelted the windshield, and the windshield wipers worked at a feverish pace, but he barely noticed it. His mind was consumed by the footage he'd seen in Seattle, Thalia and Darius in their bedroom, their kiss, their betrayal. He canceled the last day of his trip, citing a family emergency, and took the next flight home. He didn't warn Talia he wanted to take her by surprise, to see the truth with her own eyes. The Lawrence house appeared around the corner, its warm lights a mockery of what Xavier was feeling. He parked at the curb, without going into the garage, so as not to give away his presence. His phone was charged, the camera footage was saved and ready to be played back. He knew that he was taking a step from which there would be no return, but rage mixed with pain pushed him forward. Xavier quietly entered the house, his boots leaving wet footprints on the oak floor. Voices could be heard from the living room, a man's low, confident laugh and Thalia's soft voice. He froze, his heart pounding. He recognized that laugh. Darius came. He stepped into the living room, his movements slow, almost mechanical. Thalia and Darius sat on the couch, glasses of wine in their hands, their knees almost touching. Thalia was wearing a light dress, her hair was down, and she had a smile on her face that Xavier hadn't seen in months. Darius, with his shirt unbuttoned, looked relaxed, like a man confident in his authority. Thalia noticed Xavier first. Her smile disappeared, the glass shook in her hand, and the wine splashed on her dress. "Xavier," her voice was high, almost panicky. You should be in Seattle." Darius turned, his face betraying surprise for a second, but he quickly pulled himself together, placing the glass on the table. "Mr. Lawrence," he said, standing up. His voice was smooth as silk. "Glad to see you. Thalia and I were discussing a work project." Xavier looked at them, his face stony, but inside there was a fire raging. He slowly took his phone out of his pocket and raised it like a weapon. "Work project?" His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. Then maybe you could explain this. He opened the app and turned on recording. The screen showed the living room, the same one where they were now standing, but from the morning scene. Thalia and Darius enter, hug, and their conversation turns into a kiss. The sound was muffled, but Thalia's words, "Xavier in Seattle until Friday," were clear as a blow. Thalia turned pale, her hand pressed to her lips. She took a step back, bumping into the sofa. "Xavier, this." Her voice trembled, her eyes filled with tears. "It's not what you think." Darius raised his hands, his face became serious, but concern flashed in his eyes. "Look, Xavier, let's not jump to conclusions," he said, trying to sound calm. "This is a misunderstanding. We can explain everything." Xavier laughed, but it was harsh, almost wild. "Misunderstanding." He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Darius. "You're in my house with my wife, and this is a misunderstanding. I saw everything, Kane. All." Thalia sobbed, her hands shaking. "Xavier, please." She grabbed his sleeve, her voice breaking. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean to. I love you. I love Lillian. Let me explain." He pulled his hand away, his eyes burning. "Explain," he barked, and Thalia flinched. "You lied to me for months. You brought him into our house, into our bedroom. How can you explain this?" Darius stepped forward, his tone becoming conciliatory. "Xavier, I understand you're upset," he said, lowering his voice. "But let's talk like adults. Nobody wants this to come out. We can agree." Xavier turned to him, his fists clenching. He was taller than Darius, and at this moment his rage made him almost menacing. "Agree?" he growled. "Do you think I will sell my family for your dirty money? Or have you forgotten who your wife is, Kane? Eden Kane, daughter of Roland Winters. What do you think she'll do when she finds out? What will her father do?" Darius's face paled, but he quickly regained control. "You won't do this," he said, his voice becoming firmer. "If you reveal this, I won't be the only one who will suffer. Talia, your daughter, you will destroy your family." Xavier stepped towards him, his face inches from Darius's. "Don't you dare mention my daughter," he hissed. "You have already destroyed my family, and I'll make sure you pay for it." Talia fell onto the sofa, her face wet with tears. "Xavier, please," she begged, her voice barely audible. "I will do everything to fix this. Don't do anything that will hurt Lillian. She shouldn't know." Xavier looked at her, and for a second his rage wavered. He saw her pain, her fear, but it could not drown out his own agony. He loved her once, loved her so much that it was his world. But now this world was in ruins, and she was the reason. "You should have been thinking about Lillian when you laid with him," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "It's too late now." Darius coughed, trying to regain his attention. "Xavier, listen," he said, his tone almost pleading. "We can find a solution. Name your price. I don't want any problems, and I'm sure you don't either." Xavier looked at him, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "The price?" he asked again. "Do you think this is about money? This is about my life, Kane. My family. But since you love deals so much, here's one for you. I won't send this post to Eden and her dad just yet. But if you don't disappear from our lives, I will make you regret that you were born." Darius swallowed, his confidence fading. He nodded, but his eyes were full of calculation. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll leave. But think about it, Xavier. It's not just my life on the line." Xavier didn't answer. He turned to Thalia, who was still crying, her hands clutching the pillow like a life preserver. "Get your things," he said, his voice empty. "I don't want to see you here when I get back." Thalia shook her head, her sobs growing louder. "Xavier, no. Please. This is our home, our family. This was our house," he interrupted. "Now this is just the place where you betrayed me." He turned and left the living room, his steps echoing loudly in the silence. Darius was silent, his face tense, but he did not move. Thalia remained on the couch, her crying the only sound in the room. Xavier went up to his office and closed the door. His hands shook as he sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. He transferred the recording to another encrypted disk, making sure it was safe. He knew that his threat was not empty. He could destroy Darius by sending the recording to Eden or the press. But he also knew that it would destroy Thalia, and with her, Lillian. And this thought was the only thing that kept him from immediate action. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from a bottle on the shelf and took a sip, but it tasted like ash. He looked at the photo on the table Thalia and Lillian on the beach, laughing, happy. This was 3 years ago. Now it seemed like another life. Xavier knew he should talk to Lillian, explain it to her, but he wasn't ready. Not now. He had to control himself to protect her, to find a way to move on. But inside he felt only emptiness, as if everything that made him up had been uprooted. Xavier Lawrence sat in his office, his fingers tapping on the wooden tabletop and his eyes glued to the laptop screen. A folder with video footage was open on it. Thalia and Darius in their bedroom, their betrayal captured in clear footage. A day had passed since he found them in the living room, and the rage that had raged within him then had now given way to cold, calculating determination. He knew that this recording was his weapon, and he was going to use it. The house was quiet, almost ominous. Thalia stayed, despite his words, but kept her distance, locking herself in the guest room. Lillian, feeling the tension, went to her friends after school, and Xavier was glad of this. He was not ready to explain the truth to her. But he knew the time had come for the next step. He dialed Darius Kane's number, his fingers moving mechanically as if someone else were doing it. Xavier, Darius' voice on the other end was smooth, but there was a sense of wariness in it. "I was waiting for your call." "I have no doubt," Xavier replied, his tone icy. "We need to meet. Today, in your office at 6. Darius paused, and Xavier could imagine his face, tense, with a slight hint of fear hidden behind a mask of confidence. "Okay," Darius finally said, "but let's do it without making too much noise. We both want to keep this between us." Xavier chuckled, but the laugh was bitter. "It's up to you, Kane. 6 o'clock. Don't be late." He hung up before Darius could answer. His gaze fell on the photograph on the table Thalia and Lillian laughing on the beach. He turned away, unable to look. The Xavier who smiled in this photo was a different person. He was now a man willing to be blackmailed, and the thought, while disgusting, gave him a sense of control. The Kane Associates office was the epitome of success. Glass walls, marble floors, paintings by contemporary artists. Xavier entered the reception area at exactly 6, his dark suit impeccable, but his face stony. The secretary, a young woman with a perfect smile, escorted him to Darius's office without further questions. Darius was waiting for him, sitting at a massive table. His beard was neatly trimmed, but there were shadows under his eyes, betraying a sleepless night. He stood up, extending his hand, but Xavier ignored the gesture, sitting down opposite him. "Let's go without further ado," Xavier said, his voice low, almost threatening. "You know why I'm here." Darius nodded, his face tense but trying to remain calm. "I understand you're angry," he began, folding his hands on the table, "and you have a reason. But let's speak like reasonable people. What do you want?" Xavier looked at him, his eyes as cold as the winter sky. $2 million, he said, his voice level, but every word dropped like a stone. "For my silence, you will transfer them to the account I indicated within a week, and you will disappear from Thalia's life. Forever." Darius blinked, his face showing shock for a second, but he quickly regained control. "2 million?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "Xavier, are you serious? It's not just money, it's—" "This is the price of your reputation," Xavier interrupted, leaning closer. "Or do you think that Eden Kane and her father, Senator Winters, would be happy to see you having sex with my wife in our house? One call, Kane, and your career, your marriage, your life, it will all turn to ashes." Darius swallowed, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. He knew Xavier wasn't bluffing. The tape was too incriminating, and Roland Winters' influence was too great. "You're playing with fire, Lawrence," Darius said, his voice quieter, but there was a threat in it. "If you do this, everyone will suffer. Talia, your daughter." Don't you dare mention my daughter, Xavier snapped, his fists clenching. You have already destroyed my family. Now I decide how far this goes. Darius raised his hands as if in surrender. Okay, okay, he said, his tone becoming conciliatory. 2 million. I'll do it. But I need time. A week is too fast. 5 days, Xavier snapped. And don't try to play with me, Kane. I have copies of the recording, and they are in a safe place. One wrong step, and they're at Eden's. Darius nodded, his face grim, but a spark of calculation flashed in his eyes. He knew he was agreeing, but he was already thinking about how to neutralize Xavier, maybe hiring someone to delete the tapes or finding dirt on himself. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. We agree, he said, holding out his hand. But this is the end, Xavier. After that, we're even. Xavier didn't shake hands. He stood up, his gaze heavy. We will never be even, he said and walked out, leaving Darius alone. Meanwhile, at the Lawrence house, Talia sat in the guest room, her eyes red from crying. She didn't sleep all night, replaying yesterday's scene in her head. Xavier's face, full of pain and anger, his words, which cut like a knife. She knew she had destroyed everything: their marriage, their family, their trust. But what killed her most was the thought of Lillian. She should have talked to her, explained, or at least tried. Talia walked down into the living room, her steps unsteady. Lillian returned from her friends and sat on the sofa, buried in the phone. Her long dark hair fell over her face, hiding her expression, but Thalia could see how tense her shoulders were. Lil, Thalia called, her voice hoarse. Can we talk? Lillian looked up, and her eyes were cold, almost alien. About what? She asked, her tone sharp. About how you will miss my exhibition again? Or about why Dad screamed yesterday? Thalia winced, her hands clenching the hem of her sweater. Honey, it's difficult, she began, sitting down next to her, but Lillian moved away. Dad and I, we have problems. But I want you to know that I love you. I will always love you. Lillian snorted, her face contorted with anger. Do you love it? She asked, her voice trembling. You're always somewhere, Mom. You don't even notice me, and now you're lying that you love. I'm not stupid. I know something is wrong. Talia felt tears sting her eyes. She wanted to hug Lillian, but knew her daughter would push her away. Lil, I made a mistake, she said, her voice breaking. A big mistake. But I want to fix this. Give me a chance. Lillian stood up, her phone falling onto the sofa. To correct? She shouted, her eyes shining with tears. You destroyed everything. I heard Dad say that you betrayed him. How can you fix this? Thalia opened her mouth, but the words stuck. She saw the pain in Lillian's eyes, and it was worse than Xavier's anger. She extended her hand, but Lillian recoiled. Don't touch me, she said, her voice becoming quieter, but full of venom. I don't want to see you. Lillian grabbed her backpack and ran out of the house, slamming the door. Talia was left alone, her hands trembling and tears streaming down her cheeks. She fell onto the sofa, clutching her pillow, and cried, feeling hope slipping away like sand through her fingers. Xavier returned home late. His face was tired, but there was a dark fire in his eyes. He walked into the office without looking at Thalia, who was sitting in the living room. She wanted to speak, but his closed door was a clear signal. She knew he wouldn't forgive her, but the thought of Lillian, of her anger, was what broke her the most. In the office, Xavier opened the laptop and checked the cloud disk. The recording was there. He knew that blackmail was not a solution, not a cure, but it gave him control, which he lost when Thalia chose Darius. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but didn't drink it, just looked at the glass as if it held the answer. Darius, sitting in his office, was already calling his financial advisor, discussing how to quietly transfer 2 million. But his mind was working on another plan: find a way to destroy the tape, discredit Xavier, protect himself. He knew Xavier was dangerous, but he wasn't about to give up. Thalia, alone in the living room, looked at the photo of Lillian on the shelf. She knew she had lost her daughter, and that loss was worse than Xavier's anger. She wanted to fight, but didn't know where to start. Xavier, Darius, Thalia, Lillian, each of them was in their own hell, and their paths plunged deeper into a conflict that no one could stop. Darius Kane sat in his office, looking at the financial transfer page on his laptop screen. The $2 million required by Xavier Lawrence were already ready to be sent to the specified account. His fingers hovered over the confirm button, but he hesitated. It wasn't just money, it was humiliation, an admission of defeat. He, the man who always got away with it, was now backed into a corner. His gaze slid to the photograph on the table. Him and Eden at a charity event, their smiles the perfect mask of success. He knew that if Xavier carried out his threat, this mask would shatter into pieces. Outside, Portland was bathed in the gray light of a rainy morning, and the noise of the city seemed distant, almost unreal. Darius leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He's already contacted a private investigator to find dirt on Xavier, anything that could neutralize him. But so far there have been no results, and time is running out. He had to buy time, convince Xavier that the payment was on the way, and at the same time find a way to destroy the recording. But his thoughts were interrupted by the secretary's call. "Mr. Kane, Mr. Walters here." The voice was tense, and Darius frowned. Walters, the firm's senior partner, rarely came unannounced. "Let him come in," Darius replied, closing the laptop. He straightened his tie and put on his best smile, but a sense of foreboding tightened his chest. Walters, a man of about 60 with a stern face and gray temples, entered without the usual courtesy. There was a thin folder in his hand, and his gaze was as cold as steel. "Darius, we need to talk," he said, sitting down without invitation. "And it won't be pleasant." Darius felt his heart skip a beat, but remained calm. "What happened, Richard?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Problems with the client." Walters opened the folder and threw several printed pages onto the table. Darius looked at them, and his blood froze. These were screenshots from an article published in the local Portland Chronicle. The headline read, "Influential lawyer at center of scandal, affair with subordinate." Below are blurry stills from the recording. Him and Talia in the living room of the Lawrence house, their embrace, their closeness. Xavier's name was not mentioned, but the anonymous source claimed that the recording was provided by a trusted person. "This went online an hour ago," Walters said, his voice heavy. "And this is just the beginning. Clients are already calling, demanding an explanation. The Hendersons revoked the contract. Do you understand what this means for the company?" Darius swallowed, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. He knew who did it. Xavier. This bastard didn't wait for his money, he went further, hitting where it hurt the most. "Richard, this is a misunderstanding," Darius began, but his voice sounded unconvincing even to himself. "I'll sort it out. This is someone's attempt to denigrate me." Walters shook his head, his face unreadable. "Misunderstanding?" he asked again. "Darius, this is a disaster. You are not just a lawyer, you are the face of our firm. And now this face is in the dirt. The board of partners made a decision. You're distant." Immediately. Darius froze, his mind refusing to accept the words. Suspended, his voice trembled. "Richard, I bring millions to the company. You can't." "We can," Walters interrupted, standing up. "And we will. Pack your things, and pray that it doesn't end up in court." He walked out, leaving Darius alone. He looked at the screenshots, his hands trembling. He knew it was the end of his career, his reputation, his life as he knew it. But the worst thing was that now it would get to Eden, and her father. Eden Kane stood in her office, her fingers gripping her phone so tightly that the plastic creaked. She had just finished reading an article in the Portland Chronicle, and every word felt like a blow. Screenshots, descriptions, hints of a subordinate, everything pointed to Darius and his affair. She knew who Talia Lawrence was. She'd seen her at corporate events, beautiful, smart, but she never thought she'd be a threat. Now the truth was in front of her, and humiliation burned her like acid. Her phone vibrated, a call from her father. Eden answered, her voice cold but firm. "Dad, I already saw it," she said, not allowing Roland Winters to speak. "This is true." The senator's voice was as heavy as granite. "Eden, I warned you about him," he said. "This man is a mistake. What are you going to do?" Eden looked at the photo on the table, her and Darius, their wedding. She felt her throat constrict, but no tears came. Instead, rage grew inside her, not hot, but cold, calculating. "I'll file for divorce," she said, her voice level, "and I will make sure he never recovers from this." Roland chuckled, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. "Fine. I've already spoken to the people on the bar council. His license is in question, and if he tries to resist, I will make sure that he will not find work even in the outback." Eden nodded, although her father could not see her. "Thank you, Dad," she said. "I'll sort it out." She hung up and walked to the window, looking out at her garden. Her life, her reputation were at stake, but she would not allow Darius to drag her down with him. She knew the divorce would be painful, but it was the only way to clear her name, and she will do everything to make him pay for his betrayal. Darius returned home late, his face gray as ash. He knew that Eden had already seen the article. Her silence was louder than any words. He walked into the living room where she was sitting on the couch, her blonde hair pulled back into a perfect bun and her eyes like a blade. "Eden," he began, his voice hoarse, "I can explain." She raised her hand to stop him. "Don't," she said, her voice icy. "I saw everything. You disgraced me, our family, everything we built. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Darius stepped closer, his hands shaking. "It was a mistake," he said, trying to sound sincere. "Thalia, it didn't mean anything. I love you, Eden. We can fix this." Eden laughed, but the laugh was harsh, almost cruel. "To correct?" she asked, standing up. "You lost your company, Darius. Clients are fleeing like rats from a ship, and I'm filing for divorce. My father will already make sure you don't get up. You're nobody, Darius, and you will never be anyone again." He froze, his face contorted in shock. "Eden, please," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't do this. We can agree." "Agree?" She stepped towards him, her eyes burning. "Did you think you could humiliate me and get away with it? Get out of my house. Now." Darius looked at her, his confidence crumbling like sand. He knew she wasn't bluffing. Her father, Roland Winters, could destroy him with one call. He nodded, his shoulders slumping, and left without saying a word. Xavier sat in his office, looking at his phone screen. The Portland Chronicle article was open, and he read it again and again, feeling grimly satisfied. He sent the recording anonymously through an encrypted server, making sure his name would not appear. He knew it would destroy Darius, and that was exactly what he wanted. But there was no relief. Instead, he felt empty, as if his revenge was just a temporary band-aid on a wound that was still bleeding. He thought about Thalia, about her tears, about Lillian, who now barely spoke to him. He knew his actions hurt them all, but he couldn't stop. Darius deserved it, he told himself, and Talia too. But deep down he knew that he was punishing not only them, but also himself. Xavier poured himself a glass of whiskey, but didn't drink it. He looked at the photo of Lillian on the table, her smile, and felt his resolve waver. He had to start a new life for her, for himself. But first he had to make sure Darius paid in full. Darius, standing in the hotel room where he moved after leaving home, looked at the city outside the window. His career was in ruins, his marriage was destroyed, his reputation was destroyed, but he didn't give up. He knew he had to survive, find a way to clear his name. He had already contacted a lawyer to challenge his removal from the firm and was looking for contacts who could help. He doesn't allow Xavier and Eden to win. Not so easy. Eden, sitting in her office, opened her laptop and began writing a letter to her lawyer. The divorce was just the beginning. She was going to make sure Darius never forgot what it was like to cross her path. Her status, her name were her armor, and she would not allow anyone to penetrate it. Xavier Lawrence stood in his office, looking at the papers his lawyer had just brought. The divorce petition lay on the table, its black letters as sharp as a blade. He signed it in the morning without hesitation, but now, looking at the document, he felt something inside him shrinking. It was the end not only of the marriage, but also of the life he had been building for more than 10 years. He knew it was right that Thalia had ruined everything with her betrayal, but that didn't make the moment any easier. Outside, Portland was drowning in autumn rain, and the house, once full of warmth, now seemed empty. Lillian was at school, but her presence in recent days was almost ghostly. She barely spoke, locked herself in her room, and her eyes, so similar to his, were full of pain. Xavier knew that he had to protect her, give her stability, but he himself felt the ground disappearing from under his feet. He picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer, Mark, a man with a stern voice and an impeccable reputation. "Mark, is everything ready?" Xavier asked, his voice level but tired. "Yes," answered Mark. "The documents have been submitted. The court will schedule a hearing in a couple of weeks. Given the circumstances, the witnesses' custody of Lillian will almost certainly be yours. Talia may challenge, but her chances are minimal." Xavier nodded, although Mark couldn't see him. "Fine. Keep me posted." He hung up and looked at the photo of Lillian on the table, her smile at the school concert 2 years ago. He had to do this for her sake. Thalia lost her right to be a part of their lives when she chose Darius. But the thought of Lillian losing her mother cut him like a knife. Talia Lawrence sat in her rented apartment on the outskirts of Portland, looking at the boxes she had yet to unpack. The apartment was small, with worn linoleum and a damp smell, but it was all she could afford after her dismissal. The scandal with Darius, which spread across the local media, destroyed her career. Kane and Associates terminated her contract the same day the Portland Chronicle article appeared, citing reputational risks. Colleagues who had once smiled at her now looked away or whispered behind her back. She was an outcast, and this feeling was eating away at her like acid. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling as she opened the chat with Lillian. "The last message from my daughter was a week ago. Don't write to me." Thalia typed the text anyway. "Lil, please, let's talk. I know you're angry, but I love you." She pressed send, but after a minute the screen showed that the message had not been delivered. Lillian blocked her. Thalia put her phone down, her eyes filled with tears. She stood up and went to the window, looking out at the gray street where passers-by were hiding under umbrellas. She lost everything: family, job, respect. But worst of all was the emptiness inside, the feeling that she herself had ruined her life. She thought about Darius, about his compliments, about how he made her feel alive. Now it seemed like a stupid illusion for which she had paid too high a price. She returned to the boxes and began unpacking, hoping the routine would distract her. But every object, a book, a photograph, Lillian's old t-shirt, was a reminder of the past. She found a family photo album and opened it, her fingers trembling. There was a photo from their trip to Yellowstone, her, Xavier, and Lillian laughing by the geyser. Thalia clutched the album to her chest, her tears dripping onto the plastic pages. She knew that she had to fight, to try to bring Lillian back, but every day her strength was fading. She picked up the phone, wrote messages that she didn't send, called Xavier, but he didn't answer. Her world narrowed to this apartment, to her guilt, to her loneliness. Lillian sat in her room, her headphones blaring loud music, drowning out the world. Her sketchbook lay on the table, open to a page with a dark drawing. A dark figure surrounded by shadows, with a face similar to her mother's. She had not drawn for several days, her hands refused to obey, and her thoughts were too heavy. She knew that her parents were getting divorced. Xavier told her about this yesterday. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed pain. He didn't explain why, but Lillian didn't ask. She heard them arguing, saw an article on the internet, and knew that her mother had done something terrible. Her phone vibrated, but she didn't look at the screen. She blocked her mom after the last message because every word from her was like a blow. Lillian wanted to hate her, but hatred was mixed with sadness, and that was the worst of all. She missed her mother, the one who baked pancakes on Sundays, laughed at her jokes, hugged her when she was sad. But that mother disappeared, and Lillian did not know how to get her back. She stood up and walked to the window, looking at the rain. Her room, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. She was thinking about the exhibition at school that was supposed to take place tomorrow, but she didn't want to go. Her paintings, full of darkness, were too personal, too raw. She was afraid that people would see her pain, and this would make her even more vulnerable. Xavier knocked on the door and Lillian took off her headphones. "Lil, can I come in?" His voice was soft, but tired. "Yes," she answered, sitting down on the bed. Xavier walked in, his face was pale, but he smiled, trying to look normal. "How are you, honey?" he asked, sitting down next to her. "Tomorrow is your exhibition. Are you nervous?" Lillian shrugged, fiddling with the hem of her sweater. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Maybe I won't go." Xavier frowned, his hand touching her shoulder. "Lil, your paintings are amazing. You've been working on them for months. Don't let all this stops you." She looked at him, her eyes full of pain. "Dad, why did Mom do this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did she betray us?" Xavier froze, his face tense. He wanted to protect her, to lie, but he knew that she deserved the truth, at least part of it. "I don't know, Lil," he said, his voice hoarse. "Sometimes people make mistakes, big mistakes, but it's not your fault, and I will always be here, I promise." Lillian nodded, but her eyes filled with tears. She turned away, not wanting him to see her weakness. Xavier put his arm around her, and for a second she allowed herself to press against him, but then pulled away. "I want to be alone," she said, her voice barely audible. Xavier nodded, his heart sinking. He walked out, closing the door, and felt his own pain intensify. He knew that he had to be strong for Lillian's sake, but every look she gave, every tear she cried reminded him that he could not protect her from this nightmare. Thalia sat in a cafe across the street from Lillian's school, her fingers clutching a cup of cold coffee. She knew that the exhibition was tomorrow, and she wanted to come and see her daughter, even if she didn't want to talk. She wrote a letter, a long one, full of apologies, explanations, love, and carried it in her bag, hoping to give it to Lillian. But every time she imagined her cold gaze, her resolve melted. She looked at the school gates, where the students were coming out after classes, laughing and chatting. Lillian appeared in the crowd, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her face obscured by her hair. Thalia stood up, her heart pounding, but Lillian froze when she saw her. Their eyes met for a second, and Talia saw anger mixed with pain in them. Lillian turned and walked away in the other direction. Her steps were fast, almost running. Thalia sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. She took the letter out of her bag, but did not follow her daughter. She knew Lillian wasn't ready, and perhaps never would be. This thought was like a blow, and Thalia felt her depression, already severe, becoming almost tangible. She ordered a glass of wine, then another, hoping the alcohol would dull the pain, but it only made it worse. Xavier returned to his office and opened his laptop, checking his business emails. His company continued to grow despite the chaos in his personal life, and it was the only thing that kept him afloat. He received a letter from his Seattle partners confirming the contract and felt a slight sense of satisfaction. But it was fleeting. He knew he had to move forward for Lillian's sake, for his own sake, but every step was like walking on broken glass. He thought about Thalia, about her tears, about how she begged him to forgive him. Part of him wanted to feel sorry for her, but another, a large part, saw only her betrayal. He knew that divorce was the only way, but the thought of Lillian losing her mother tormented him. He was supposed to be a father, a protector, but he felt helpless in the face of her pain. Thalia returned to her apartment late, her steps unsteady from the wine. She fell onto the sofa, her gaze falling on the empty bottles on the table. She knew she was drowning, but she couldn't stop. She picked up her phone and wrote another message to Lillian, knowing it wouldn't get through. "I will always love you, Lil. I'm sorry." She pressed send and closed her eyes, feeling the darkness absorbs it. Xavier, Lillian, Thalia, their family was destroyed, and each of them was now alone in their own hell. The divorce was just the beginning, and the road ahead promised to be long and painful. Xavier Lawrence stood on the porch of his new home in Boulder, Colorado, looking out over the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The air was fresh, almost cutting, and the sun reflected off the white blanket that enveloped the lawn. The house was more modest than their mansion in Portland, 2 stories, with wood paneling and large windows, but it was theirs, his and Lillian's. Moving was his decision, an attempt to escape from the past that clung to them like a shadow. But even here, in this new life, he felt its weight. There was a knocking sound from inside the house as Lillian unpacked boxes in her room. Her voice humming along to the music was a rare glimpse of warmth in their new reality. Xavier sold the house in Portland, closed all ties with that city, with that life. His company, Greenforge Solutions, continued to grow, and he decided to open a location in Boulder, where the green technology market was booming. It was a step forward, but each step was difficult. He entered the house, brushing snow off his boots. The living room was still half empty. A sofa, a coffee table, a few boxes against the wall. Lillian came down the stairs, her long dark hair pulled back into a messy bun and a sketchbook in her hands. "Dad, did you see the view from my room?" she asked, her eyes lighting up for a second. "Mountains, just like in the picture. I want to draw them." Xavier smiled, feeling slightly relieved. Lillian had rarely shown enthusiasm in recent months, and her interest in drawing was the only thing that connected her with her old self. "This is cool, Lil," he said, taking off his jacket. "Will you show me later?" She nodded, but her smile quickly faded. She sat down on the couch, opening her sketchbook, and her pencil began to move across the paper. Xavier looked at her, feeling his heart clench. The divorce, the scandal, Talia's departure, all of this had left Lillian with scars that he didn't know how to heal. He tried to be a support for her, but her silence, her gloomy drawings spoke louder than any words. "Are you hungry?" he asked, heading towards the kitchen. "I can order pizza." "Not really," she answered without looking up. "But if you want, order it." Xavier nodded, understanding that this was her way of keeping her distance. He took out his phone and ordered pizza, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought about the past, about Thalia, about how her betrayal still poisoned him. He tried to move forward, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her with Darius, and this picture was like a knife. Greenforge Solutions' Boulder location opened within a month of their move. The office was small but modern, with panoramic windows overlooking the mountains. Xavier threw himself into work, hiring new employees, concluding contracts, expanding his network of suppliers. Work was his anchor, what kept him afloat when everything else was falling apart. But even here, among the drawings and reports, he felt empty. At one of his meetings with local partners, he met Evelyn Marshall, an architect whose firm collaborated with his company. Evelyn was a woman in her 40s, with warm brown eyes and a soft smile that seemed genuine. She was divorced, had a teenage son, and had a quiet confidence that attracted Xavier even though he didn't want to admit it. "Your materials are incredible, Xavier," said Evelyn, sitting opposite him in a cafe after the meeting. They discussed the project of a residential complex, but the conversation gradually turned informal. "I saw your reports on carbon emissions. This is a game changer." Xavier smiled, but his smile was restrained. "Thank you," he said, stirring his coffee. "We are trying to make the world a better place, step by step." Evelyn nodded, her gaze attentive. "It's noticeable," she said. "But if I may, you look like you're carrying the whole world on you." "Everything is fine?" Xavier froze, his fingers clenching around his cup. He was not used to such questions in Portland. No one dared to interfere in his personal space, except for Clara, his assistant. But Evelyn asked not out of curiosity, but out of sincere concern, and this unsettled him. "It's just a lot of changes," he said, looking away. "Moving, new life. You probably know how it happens." Evelyn nodded, her eyes softening. "I know," she said. "After my divorce, I thought that I would never find myself. But time helps. And good people too." Xavier looked at her, feeling her words touch something inside. He wanted to open up, talk about Talia, about the pain that still lived in him, but the fear of a new betrayal kept him in place. "Maybe you're right," he said, forcing himself to smile. "But for now, I'm focused on Lillian. She is my priority." Evelyn nodded, her smile warm. "That makes you a good father," she said. "If you want coffee or just a chat, you know where to find me." Xavier nodded, feeling a slight warmth from her words. But when he left the cafe, his thoughts returned to Thalia, to her lies, and the warmth faded. He wasn't ready to trust, not now, maybe never. Lillian sat in her new room, her easel set up by the window overlooking the mountains. She had been drawing for an hour, her pencil moving quickly, leaving sharp lines on the paper. A dark forest, the figure of a girl surrounded by shadows. But now something new has appeared in her drawings, light strokes of light breaking through the trees. She didn't know why she added them, but it was like a hint of hope that she was afraid to admit. Her new school in Boulder was different, smaller, quieter, with teachers who seemed genuinely interested. Her art teacher, Miss Clark, noticed her talent and invited her to participate in a local exhibition. Lillian agreed, although her heart sank at the thought of strangers seeing her work. But drawing was her way of coping, her language when words failed. She heard Xavier come home and went down to the living room. He stood at the kitchen island, flipping through the mail, his face tired, but he smiled when he saw her. "Hey, Lil," he said, putting the envelopes aside. "How are you? Did you draw something cool?" Lillian shrugged, but her lips twitched into a smile. "Maybe," she said. "Miss Clark wants me to show my work at the city exhibition, but I'm not sure." Xavier walked up to her, his eyes lighting up. "This is great," he said. "Lil, you have to do this. Your paintings are special. I'll come, I promise." Lillian nodded, but her gaze became more serious. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, her voice quiet. "You're so tense all the time." Xavier froze, his smile fading. He wanted to lie, to say that everything was fine, but her eyes, so honest, did not allow him to do this. "I'm trying, Lil," he said, his voice hoarse. "Moving, working. It's not easy, but I'm here for you. Always." Lillian nodded, but her gaze was full of doubt. She wanted to ask about her mother, about why everything collapsed, but the words stuck. Instead, she hugged him. Her hug was quick, almost awkward, but Xavier felt his heart clench. He hugged her back, hoping she would feel his love, even if he couldn't give her answers. A few weeks later, Xavier and Evelyn met again, this time at the opening of a new project where their companies were collaborating. The evening was noisy, with champagne and speeches, but they found a corner where they could talk. Evelyn talked about her son and his passion for rock climbing, and Xavier found himself listening to her with a smile. "You should try to climb the mountain," Evelyn said, her eyes sparkling. "It clears your head. Maybe you can take Lillian? She might like it." Xavier nodded, feeling her enthusiasm infect him. "Maybe we'll try," he said, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for extreme adventures." Evelyn laughed. Her laughter was as warm as a summer day. "No one is ready until they try," she said. "But if anything, I know a good instructor." They talked for another hour, and Xavier felt his defenses weakening. Evelyn was different, not like Thalia, not like anyone from his past. She was sincere, and it frightened him as much as it attracted him. When the evening ended, she wrote her number on a napkin and handed it to him. "Call me if you decide to try the mountains," she said, her smile soft, or just like that. Xavier took the napkin, his fingers lingering on her hand a second longer than necessary. He nodded, but didn't promise anything. When he returned home, the napkin remained in his pocket, a reminder of an opportunity he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. Lillian stood in front of her easel, her new painting almost finished. Mountains, light, shadows. It was not as dark as her previous works, but it still carried her pain. She thought about her mother, about how her absence had become a part of her life. She missed her, but the anger was still stronger. Drawing helped not to heal, but to control myself. Xavier walked into her room, his face softer than usual. "Lil, I'm proud of you," he said, looking at the painting. "You're doing something real. Don't let anything take that away." Lillian nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she smiled. "Thank you, Dad," she said. "I'm trying." Xavier hugged her, and this time she didn't pull away. They stood there for several seconds, and in this silence there was more hope than in any words. Xavier knew that the past was still with him, but for Lillian's sake he had to try. and maybe for my own sake too. Talia Lawrence sat on a sagging couch in her rented apartment on the outskirts of Portland, her fingers clutching an empty wine glass. Outside, the rain pattered on the tin sill, and the dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows on the bare walls. The apartment was almost empty. A few boxes, a cheap table, a mattress on the floor. All that was left of her life with Xavier and Lillian, a life full of warmth and hope, was now just a memory that she tried to drown out. On the table in front of her stood a bottle of wine, half empty, and a bottle of medicine that she had taken from the pharmacy a week ago. She didn't plan anything, didn't think about the end, she just wanted the pain to subside, at least for the night. Every day was a struggle, with guilt, with loneliness, with the emptiness that consumed her. She had lost her job, her family, her respect, and now, when she looked in the mirror, she did not recognize the woman who looked back at her. Thalia picked up the phone, her fingers trembling as she opened the gallery. There was a photograph of Lillian, her smile at the school exhibition 2 years ago, her eyes full of dreams. Thalia swiped her finger across the screen, her throat tightening. She wrote dozens of messages to her daughter, but all of them remained unanswered. Lillian blocked her, and the silence was worse than any scream. Thalia knew she deserved it, but the thought that her daughter would never forgive her was unbearable. She put the phone down and picked up a piece of paper that was lying on the table. It was the letter she started yesterday, the words she couldn't say out loud. She wrote it for Lillian, hoping that someday her daughter would read it and maybe understand it. Her handwriting was uneven, the ink was smeared from tears, but she continued. Lil, my girl, I don't know if you'll read this, but I have to try. I made a terrible mistake, and there are no words to explain how much I regret it. You were my light, my meaning, and I failed you. I don't ask for forgiveness, I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you and always will. Be strong, my girl. Be better than me. Mother. Thalia reread the letter, her tears dripping onto the paper. She wanted to send it, but the fear that Lillian would simply throw it away stopped her. She folded the sheet and hid it in her desk drawer, next to the other unsent letters. Maybe someday, she thought, but that someday seemed so far away. Thalia lay down on the sofa, her gaze falling on the ceiling where the cracks resembled cobwebs. She thought about Lillian, about her laughter, about how they drew together when her daughter was little. She thought about Xavier, about his eyes, full of love, which now looked at her with hatred. She closed her eyes. Lillian Lawrence sat in her room in Boulder, her easel set up by the window. The mountains behind the glass were covered with snow, and their grandeur inspired her. She drew, her pencil moving quickly, leaving lines of light and shadow on the paper. Her paintings still bore traces of pain, but something new appeared in them, hope, timid but real. She didn't know where it came from, but drawing was her way of moving forward, of finding herself in this new world. She thought about her mother less often, but every time her image came to mind, Lillian felt a pang of anger mixed with melancholy. She didn't want to forgive her, didn't want to think about her, but sometimes, in silence, she missed her voice, her hugs. She drove away these thoughts, focusing on school, on art, on her new life with Dad. She needed to be strong, and she tried. Her phone vibrated, and she looked at the screen. It was a message from a friend in Portland, Emma. Lil, did you hear? It's about your mom. I'm so sorry. Lillian frowned, her heart pounding. She opened the link Emma had sent, and her breathing stopped. It was an article in the local newspaper. Woman found dead in apartment. Lillian read, her hands trembling. Xavier was in the office when he received a call from Mark, his lawyer. His voice was heavy, and Xavier immediately felt that something was wrong. Xavier, I just got word, Mark said. Talia, she was found this morning. She died. They believe that it was. Not an accident. Xavier froze, his hand clutching his phone. He expected a lot anger, tears, even relief, but instead he felt only emptiness. Thalia, the woman he loved, the mother of his daughter, was dead. He didn't know how to accept it. Thank you, Mark, he said, his voice mechanical. I will sort it out. He hung up and looked at the mountains outside the window. He should have told Lillian, but the thought of it tore him apart. He knew that she blamed Thalia, but he also knew that she loved her, and this loss would be another scar on her heart. In the evening, Xavier returned home. His face was pale, but he tried to hold on. Lillian sat in the living room, her sketchbook closed and her eyes red. She already knew that the news was spreading faster than he expected. "Lil," he began, sitting down next to him, but she raised her hand, stopping him. "I know, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Emma sent me an article." Xavier nodded, his throat tightening. He wanted to hug her, but she sat motionless, her hands squeezing her knees. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. I'm sorry." Lillian looked at him. Her eyes were full of pain, but there was also determination in them. "I don't know either," she said, "but I don't want to talk about it." "Not now." Xavier nodded, understanding her. He knew that she would cope in her own way, through her drawings, through silence. He could only be there, and he was going to do it. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.